Sure, yeah. Get up and walk around.
Yeah, I'll do
some film.
bits to test out.
All right. Da-da-da. What am I doing? There we are. Okay. So welcome, friends, both in person and on the internet, to the launch of Joseph Lezza's I'm Never Fine, Scenes and Spasms on Loss, with Greg Mania, or Mania.
Yeah, it's up to you. I'm feeling frisky. Just
Reader's choice.
Yes.
My name is Greg Newton. I am the co-founder of the Bureau, along with my partner, Don Dokum. We are an all-volunteer bookstore and event space, and today we are being helped by Drew Pissarra. And yeah, we've been here since 2014. We've been in existence since 2012. And we survive in this harsh world through donations and book sales. So I'm going to pass this around. We have a suggested donation of $10. If you're able to give something, great. If not, we still love you. And if you'd rather buy something here, perhaps Joseph's book, then we encourage you to do that as well. Do it all. You can also Venmo us at BGSQD if you're at home. All right, so before I introduce our readers, I'm going to read a quick land acknowledgement. So the Bureau acknowledges that our organization operates on the unceded land of the Munsee Lenape. We are seeking to partner with and provide material support to a local queer Indigenous organization. And we hope to make an announcement about this partnership in the near future. But in the meantime, we encourage you to join the Bureau and signing up to make a monthly donation to the American Indian Community House's Mannahatta Fund. The Mannahatta Fund, according to its website, is an invitation to all settlers and non-native people who wish to acknowledge the legacy of theft and genocide that comprise the history of New York City and the United States. So you can find out more at mannahattafund.org. All right, so our readers. Joseph Lezza is a writer in New York, New York, holding an MFA in creative writing from the University of Texas at El Paso. He is a 2021 finalist for the Prize Americana in Prose. His work has been featured in, among others, Oculum, Variant Literature, The Hopper, Stoneboat Literary Journal, West Trade Review, and Santa Fe Writers Project. His debut memoir in essays, I'm Never Fine, Scenes and Spasms on Loss, is out February 2023 from Vine Leaves Press. And it's here now. Greg Mania is a writer, comedian, and award-winning screenwriter based in New York City. His words have been published in the New York Times, The New Yorker, Vanity Fair, HuffPost, Oprah Daily, Paper, among other international online and print platforms. His debut memoir, Born to Be Public, is out now from Clash Books. Please give him a warm welcome.
Okay, so shall we start with the reading? Yes, okay. So I'm gonna hand it over to you, and then we'll chat.
Fantastic. For this guy. Well, first off, thanks everybody for coming. This story wouldn't exist if I didn't think that there was something worth writing about. The book wouldn't exist if there wasn't a publisher out there who felt it was worthy, and I wouldn't be here in front of you unless there were people like Greg and the Bureau who were just so supportive. So I'm going to read two different pieces from the book. The book exists in 3 sections and basically documents my time as a caregiver for my father as he was diagnosed and dealing with pancreatic cancer, and then the years after his passing. So the first piece takes place in the sort of second part of the book, which is the that time I spent as a caregiver. And it is called How to Shave Your Dying Father. Part 5, The First Strokes. There's no way to straddle the bed, and attempting to do this while leaning over the head would require a straight razor and the skills of a seasoned barber, neither of which I possess. Still, I need to find a way to hold him steady, because in this transaction, at least one of us shouldn't be suppressing the shakes. So I lower my knee onto the side of the mattress, taking careful steps not to mistake one of his legs for a ruffle in the blanket, accidentally crushing him. Turning his face towards the window, I rest my palm along the crest of his forehead and whisper into a near translucent earlobe. Dad, it's still me. I'm gonna start, okay? You let me know if I'm hurting you. Ah, that's all I get from him. Not permission or protest, more like acknowledgement. As if he's telling me, yes, the boy who shaved his cheeks in an upward motion for an entire year. And now he's going to take a cleaver to my face. Have at it. I pause to laugh at my uncanny ability to add context where there is none. At the fact that the guttural noise I just heard was likely involuntary and probably just the venting of acid reflux. But I like the fact that Dad's still digging at me. I like the fact that my hands are not trembling anymore. So I begin. I place the blade just above 3 sparse gray hairs that suggest what once was a sideburn. Starting in the more planar areas should allow me a few practice runs while limiting the odds of hitting a snag. In an undisturbed motion, I pull it halfway down the slope of his cheek, leaving behind a freshly pruned ribbon of turf. Into the basin go the soapy fragments of him. A swirl, a swish, and I finish the stroke. The work is good. Clean edges and well-maneuvered corners evoke more pride than the simple stroke of a razor should be afforded. Maybe it's the herbal cocktail smeared across his face, but he smells like fresh cut grass. And now I'm lining up for another run. Only this time I'm 11. Pushing through the expansive yard that sits in front of our old English colonial, I round the trees and mulched flower beds with the exactitude of a Formula One racer. The Walkman at my waist beats out a mixtape pilfered from the weeks of the noontime Hot 100. My lungs fill with exhaust and lawn clippings, and I am king of the earth, the king of the summer. Until I'm caught by the glint of sun off of silver aviator frames that peek around the corner of the garage. He's watching me again. First it was through the side light, then the drapes of the living room window. Each time I catch him, he scurries, only to be found minutes later, posted at a nearby turret. I seethe, throttling the control lever. If he doesn't trust me to do this on my own, he might as well do it himself. So I raise my pointer in accusation long enough for the mower to veer in the liberty of my one-handed grasp. Out of my mouth comes the scrape of metal as the motor housing rebounds, leaping into the air and cutting out dead upon landing. He steps from around the corner, and I wheel the contraption to the side to survey the damage. There, poking through the dirt, freed from the brush that once hit it, the root of our cherry tree. But it's his cheekbone. My arms snap back as soon as I feel the razor lift against it, and sure enough, the dusting of scruff had obscured it, the nodule poking through the sunken terrain of his face, but it doesn't bleed, or even flush. The realization stops me from swallowing my own fist, but not from picking up the stare of a single brown fish eye. All these years later, he watches me still. That was an excerpt from part 2. And now I'm going to read an excerpt from part 3 of the book. As I mentioned, the second part of the book deals with that whole linear process of, being a caregiver from diagnosis through passing. The third part, I should say, deals with sort of all of the reconciliations you have to make and all of the places that loss takes you after it occurs, the very irrational places that loss takes you. So in this particular piece, it begins on a trip that I decided to take with a friend of mine to Italy, sort of recreating a trip that my parents had taken a few years prior, because I had convinced myself, subconsciously or otherwise, that maybe if I recreated step by step the exact same route of this trip, that I may capture, some bit of residual energy. I might be able to connect to him in a way that, I otherwise wouldn't have been able to do. It's silly, it's, childish, but it's one of the things that just sort of happens. It's a natural, irrational reaction. And so this piece, where it begins, this particular excerpt, I have made a wrong turn off of the side of an Italian mountainside and have gone down a very steep bank and landed up in what can only be best described as a ravine. I stared at the dash, the two of us stunned as the motor idled, enduring. In the vacuum, there seemed to be nothing else to do but re-examine the misguided influence that had led to the Sorrentine folly. My mind's finger flailed, flicking through a portfolio of blamable subjects. The Hertz representative who heard my American accent and handed me the keys to a Ford, a car clearly inadaptable to the sensibilities of the Roman landscape. The mother who suggested a hotel at an elevation requiring access by Sherpa, the same hotel where she and dad stayed on the trip no one knew would be his last. And of course, the dewy-eyed child who took that advice as part of some sentimental scavenger hunt, as if dear father sat sipping an espresso in the lobby, waiting to welcome him with open arms. Loss is a hustler that way. It dupes the reasonable into believing the absent are not absent, but simply lost, that they slipped out for a cup of coffee and lost track of time, that death is a winnable game. Too exhausted to accept the onus, I moved to cut the engine when a knock came from the passenger side. Unable to see any feasible way to worsen the situation, Ellie, my best friend, rolled down her window without a second thought as two round elderly faces crouched and peered in at the two of us. "Hai bisogno di aiuto." A bespectacled woman smiled, unfazed by our sudden appearance. Ellie looked at me and shrugged. "Buonasera, signora," I stammered. "Siamo americani." "Ah, americani." She nodded to her silent husband as if she'd won a bet. "How can we help?" Awash with slight relief, I called up as much middle school Italian as I could muster. Dove l'hotel Villa Fiorita? Villa Fiorita? The couple turned to each other, exchanging mumbles and shrugs. "Is what street?" Snatching a wrinkled piece of paper from under the emergency brake, I scanned for the address. Via Nastro Verde. Nastro Verde, okay. Connection achieved. The woman reached in with a healthy-sized arm and pointed out my window. "Va bene. Turn around and take road back to the top." Not what I wanted to hear. "Capisce all the way." She motioned her thumb towards the ceiling. "And at a stop sign you make right is Nastro Verde." I mirrored the woman's smiling nods as my throat closed in on itself. The old man clapped twice on the roof as his wife removed herself, the two of them retreating to the porch of a house neither one of us had noticed until this very moment. "Grazie," Ellie called out as she rolled up her window and turned to me. What are the odds that the two people who live in Dante's seventh circle would speak a word of English? Better than the odds of us getting back up that hill. Sitting back in my seat, I took a deep breath and accepting my fate threw the car into reverse. The first few attempts went about as well as anticipated. We'd scaled the foot of the hill fine enough, building up momentum, yet each time, right at the point where the road vaulted towards its steepest, the car would slow to a ceremonious stop that no amount of revving seemed able to combat. Persistence would then dissolve into an ultimate resignation that saw us rolling backwards to the start. The Sisyphean task carried on. Try after try, I slammed my foot on the gas and churned through the first 4 gears. The shift was sluggish, as if being dragged through heavy cream. Try after try, the car would reach the same exact spot before offering up a squealing surrender. Somewhere around the 8th or 9th failed endeavor, it became impossible to tell which one of us was screaming louder. I screamed all the way down the hill. I screamed at the tether of the earth. I screamed until I thought my throat would bleed. The membrane wouldn't break. Fat into water, the globules of my life continued to settle at the bottom. And as tears filled my eyes, I looked out at the world through a liquid frustration that could not be whipped into a solid understanding. "It's okay," Ellie cooed from her seat, unsure of what to make of my sobbing. "Breathe. It's going to be okay." "No, it's not," I snapped. "Just grab your bags and find those old people because we live here now. We live here at the bottom of this fucking ditch. We are ditch people now." Lips pursed, she stiffened, readying for her inevitable return volley. I ran my nose across my shoulder, smothering a snot bubble the likes of which only Viola Davis could rival. But as the color bled back into my co-pilot's face, I realized her constriction was intended only to mask the shock of laughter that worked her whole body into spasms. Her eyes, 2 mirrors I could not avoid, reflected the visage of absolute lunacy. In a flash, I saw myself bellowing, feral, foaming at the mouth, while a flank of white-coated men crept towards me with enough Thorazine to housebreak a megalodon. It was inarguable, hysterical, a childish tirade from the mouth of a man who ought to know better. Short of FEMA stepping in, I was left to acknowledge that the responsibility for mitigating the slow-moving disaster that was me. So there, at literal rock bottom, I eased up on myself just a little, just enough to laugh along with her. It was a start. Thanks.
So you are very humble and sweet, but I'm not. So I'm gonna this book is so unbelievably stunning. I got it in the mail because I slid into Joe's DMs and I was like, I need a copy. And after I read the introduction, I immediately started sweating because I sent him my fucking garbage pamphlet and I'm reading this literary superstar in the making. And I think I voice noted you after I read the introduction and I was like, every sentence so far and throughout the whole book is so tenderly crafted and beautiful and funny and insightful and sort of everything that you want in a memoir, even if you're not going through grief or what have you. It's just a companion, it's a friend, and I love that about it. So, and it's also a hybrid work, right? There's poems in there, there's like sort of like written in the form of a script, there's like the Oregon Trail chapter that's like, what was sort of like the first element of the book that you were like, oh, this might unfurl into a memoir? Was it a poem? What was sort of like the inkling that then became the idea for this book?
It was actually the first essay. So the first essay, the essay that begins the book is a piece called Death, the Moon and Dry Rum Steak. And it was a piece that I wrote for a lyric essay class as part of my MFA program. And it's funny because that piece is kind of like 4 vignettes that chart the whole sort of, really charts the beginning to end of the book, but in like one standalone piece.
Right.
And I thought after I wrote that, I was like, okay, cool. Like I've addressed this grief that I'm holding on to in this piece. Great, I'm done with it. I was very wrong because as my program went on, no matter what class I was in, whether it was, a fiction class, a poetry class, an essay class, I found that the majority of the work that I was writing was somehow either directly or indirectly inspired by this part of my life. So when it came time to actually work on my thesis, which was a full-length manuscript that would eventually become this, I entered into it with about 4 or 5 finished pieces already. And that's kind of the reason why I chose the subject matter, because something was clearly telling me that there was something that needed to be written. There was something that I needed to work through, and I would never be able to write anything else until I wrote this first. So that's kind of how it started.
That's funny you mentioned that because I feel like with my book, I was like, this has to be my first book. I can't put out anything else. This has to be it. This has to be my introduction to the world. Is that how sort of you felt with this one? Was like, this has to be the first one. I can't move on until I write it and put it out.
Yeah, I had no choice.
Yeah.
It wasn't even it's so funny what you come to learn about yourself just through the practice of writing. When I decided to pursue creative writing, like in higher education, I didn't see myself as an essay writer. I didn't see myself as a memoirist at all. Who the hell am I? Who cares about my story? Like I saw myself as a fiction writer. In fact, my sample piece for my MFA program was a work of fiction. And it wasn't until, again, like I started taking those classes and I started seeing the influence that this period of my life had. And I started to be exposed to writers like Didion, like Sedaris, so many of these fantastic people who took elements of their life and wrote it in a way that made it so captivating that it almost read, novelistically, that I was like, okay, well, it's scary. It's a scary prospect to write about yourself, not because you're afraid of sharing the story, but mostly because to write nonfiction requires some element of ego. I guess you have to be able to acknowledge, like, well, yeah, like this is my story. I, am largely unknown as a writer, but I feel like the story is compelling enough that it could resonate with someone, at least one person out there. And so, yeah, it really wasn't, it wasn't an option. I just kind of came to the realization that I could not write anything else free of this until I wrote that.
And there is sort of like this sheen of fiction that I sort of see in your words, because it does at some points read like, even the way, and something that I always admire, especially with this book writing up a memoirist, is the ability to sort of make art out of the mundane. Like even the way that you just describe like the ray of light hitting something at an angle is just art. And I'm so just impressed with that. And I know that you also have a background as a poet. So, and you just mentioned that you enter, into your MFA program writing fiction. So how does like your other craft influence your memoir? Because there's poems in here,
I try not to look at anything too myopically, like a story like this, in order to be compelling, like it needs to borrow. It can't just be an account of something. Like it literally can't just be an account of like this happened and this happened and this happened. There are no stakes there. It's just a glorified list. You have to find a way to filter that story through some sort of a lens that elevates it, that makes it readable, that makes it accessible to a perfect stranger. So, you speak, you talk about like the Oregon Trail essay that I wrote, that piece was written, it's a piece that comes pretty early in the book. It comes pretty early in the process of, of the story. And in that particular moment, we're dealing with like a once in a lifetime hurricane. I'm dealing with a father who's ailing, and I'm telling you, there's nothing that makes you feel like a little kid more than to, even if you're a grown adult, and to have a parent who's like chronically and terminally ill. And so you almost regress. And in that moment, I felt so helpless that I found myself just playing this game, just because weirdly this game felt like it was giving me like some control over the situation. And so I felt like, by using the elements of the game, like I could impress upon the reader just how infantile, powerless, whatever it was, just how much like a child I felt in that particular piece. And I borrow elements from like so many different styles and structures throughout the book to kind of do that, to try to elevate it, whether it's, writing about shaving my father, for the last time, but in the guise of a step-by-step guide, writing about, what's the piece that I was just thinking about, right? Well, writing about that, the second piece that I read about that trip that I took, but, punctuated by interview excerpts from an interview that my father had done about driving, an Italian car years prior. Like it's sort of about finding a way that makes it read, that makes it jump off the page and makes it read more like a story and not just, like I said, an account of things.
How did you, because obviously there's a lot of, this is a dense subject matter, although it's peppered with humor and all that. How did you take care of yourself while writing this book? If at all?
I don't know, coffee and denial.
Because like when you're writing a book, like you're writing it for yourself, you have to tell your story, but at the end of the day, we're also selling something, and we need to sort of like find our readers and make it accessible and make it, so there has to be some sort of like area where you get to it and you're like, okay, I have to sort of put myself in the reader's seat. And it's like this sort of weird duality where you're like looking at your story from like this bird's eye view, but you're also mining like the deepest, darkest parts of yourself and what you've been through. So like, I feel like when we're talking to like, especially like up and coming writers or people who are trying to tell their story, especially if it's something that's hard to talk about, I feel like we should also talk about the care that needs to go into it, because I was not healthy. I mean, but like, especially when writing like my book, it was like, I didn't take care of myself. Like I just like kept going, and like to the point where my body literally broke. And looking back, I'm like, I wish I was a bit gentler with myself, because even though it's a comedic memoir, there's a lot of pain in there and all that. And I don't know, I feel like it's something we should be talking about. Like if you're either a debut, emerging, or established author, I don't think we really take that good care of ourselves when we're writing. So it's something that I want to sort of change, or a habit that I want to start practicing. So I don't know, how do you help?
I mean, for help. God, you called the wrong number. You know, I mean, what's funny is the book, in a weird way, like, was me helping myself. I mean, a lot of I had never truly like and properly gone through the grieving process until I started writing this book. And writing this book turned out to be my grieving process. You know, I didn't start writing this until, you know, 5-6 years separated from, you know, the loss itself. And for a long time, I was carrying that around with me because I was sort of waiting to go through, you know, that natural progression of grief that 1,000 websites and 1,000 self-help books will tell you, those 5 stages, how they're just, it's going to happen so neat and orderly, and then you're going to be done with it, you're going to be fine. And like, that didn't happen for me. Like for me, you know, one of the stages is anger. Like my only stage was anger. Like I was just angry for years, and I kept waiting to move on to, you know, whatever, the depression, the bargaining, the acceptance. And because it wasn't happening so cleanly, it just only served to make me like double down on my own anger, because not only was I angry about what happened, then I was also angry that like I couldn't even grieve properly. And so for me, like that, you know, writing the book was indeed hard, but it was also very necessary, because I didn't, up until that point, I didn't take the time to like re-examine everything that happened and to find those takeaways and to gain that insight and perspective that you sort of need.
Right. And that's the thing with grief. Like it can be 3 years after the fact or 30, and it's still, in some way, it's like a gas filling a container. It's always going to find its way to like recalibrate with itself within you. So my question to you is, and this is one that what is your relationship to grief now after writing this book? Has it changed? And if so, how?
Has it changed? I think, I mean, it's evolved for sure, but I think that anybody who goes through this process, or any sort of, you know, loss, it doesn't have to be death, like just any sort of grieving process has to come to the conclusion that like some part of it is never going to fully go away. And if you expect that to happen, it's just, you will just wasting a lot of time trying to get to a place that doesn't really exist. Like some things like this leave a mark on you, like indelibly, and you know, you carry it around with you, like you process it as much as you can, you let go of as much of it as you can, but you always, you know, you come away understanding that like some part of this is going to stick with me. And you know, there are days when it could be something so silly, it could be a sound, it could be a smell, it could be an image that evokes a painful feeling. And the only thing to do, just like writing this book, is to just work your way through it. Eventually it will subside, but you know, there are relapses like everything else. You just kind of make peace with those waves, you learn to ride them, and then you wait for the next one.
And that's something with like this type of book. And I feel like this is something that you've experienced. I mean, you wrote about it in your introduction. There's a whole part about going out with it and pitching it and being heard that, you know, the market is saturated. There's a ton of grief memoirs. There's a ton of comedic memoirs by gay people. Like there's enough room for you on the bookshelf. And I can't tell you how many times I felt like I could chuck my project and be like, well, fuck it. Like if there's not any room on the bookshelf, why bother? So what made you want to keep going with it? What made you feel like this story needs to be out in the world, despite the fact that, you know, everyone deals with grief at one point or another in their lives? But how did you keep going with it?
Well, I'll tell you, it's because I'm an indignant little shit. So, you know, any writer. I mean, if there's a writer out there who, especially a debut writer who writes their first manuscript and just hits it out of the park and lands the first agent or the first, publisher, hats off to you, because that's a miracle. I mean, I accepted that there was going to be, a measure of rejection that came with this, and I think from start to finish, it took just over a year before, like, from the beginning of the pitch process to like actually finding a publisher that was willing to publish it. Just about.
Wow, must be nice.
Just
It's a testament.
pitching in earnest. But you should see, well, if I showed you my Excel sheet of no's, you probably would be not so confident. But it is funny, like, and if you read the preface, like, I talk about this, but I remember pitching this to one particular agent who not so subtly responded to my proposal. Well, everybody's father dies. What's your hook? And I'm like,
this is real. I'm not surprised. Yeah.
This definitely happened. She also, this agent, who will remain unnamed, also said that she thought Joan Didion was one of the most overrated writers ever. So
red flag.
Red flag. But for me, that actually made me double down, because I kind of rejected this premise that like that there's only one version of an original story. Like, I mean, so everybody's father dies. Okay, great. Everybody falls in love. There are thousands of shelves filled with romance stories. Like, who cares? Like, what resonates with one person might not resonate with another. And for me, the reason why I wanted to write this particular book, and I felt like it had merit, was because, for the thousands of self-help books and, armchair therapists who like proclaim to have the answer to grief, there are, an equal number of people, if not more, who are taking this advice and are measuring themselves against this like prescriptive approach, and they will ultimately falter. We all do. And so really what I wanted to do was I wanted to write this book to show everybody like all of the mistakes I made, all of like the sort of ugliness of it, the humor of it, because I knew that there was at least one person out there who's probably going through something similar. Didn't have to be exactly the same, but who, if they could see themselves in this, maybe they might feel like, all right, I'm not alone. Like, other people have gone through this, and like eventually I'll be able to find my way out.
Right, and it does sort of set a fire under your ass to get it out there, because I remember one publisher told me, "Oh, we already have a gay funny book on our list," and I was like, okay, like, so it really was like a slap, like hand of reality was, this is, at the end of the day, our industry is a business, but there's a way to like carve your own space on the bookshelf, and I think you do such a great way of conveying that in your intro, which I'm obsessed with. And usually I told you this, but I really like my intros to be like short and sweet and succinct. Now yours is not like pages and pages long, but it's the perfect length. And it sort of really sets you as the reader up into what you're going to be experiencing. And it's so well done. I remember you telling me that you had some feedback saying that you should make the intro shorter, but you only like removed one word. What's behind the conviction? Like, why did it have to be that length? And
I'm an indignant little shit. So I don't know why. Like, I mean, you're never going to succeed as a writer unless you, take constructive criticism to heart and you learn to respond to people's feedback. But that doesn't mean that every piece of feedback needs to be followed. So when I got that note from my, developmental editor, and it really wasn't even like a suggestion, it was posed as like a question. She basically said, would you consider shortening this? And I reread it, like, they say kill your darlings, but in my opinion, in this one case, after going through it, I really felt like every word in there was essential. So, except for the one that I cut. Just
what was the word?
It's probably I don't know. I just wanted to say that it's
Article.
It's still in there. I just made it white so that you can't see it.
It's only accessible like in neon light. Okay, I don't know if I asked you this already. I'm sorry. I smoke a lot of weeds. My memory's. I want to know why, again, I want to go back to the structure of this book because I'm very fascinated with the hybrid form. And did I ask you this? Why was hybrid the correct form for this book? What made you? It couldn't just been like a linear memoir, like diagnosis, caregiving, the depth, the after that. What made this the right structure for
Right.
your story?
Well, I mean, there is still a structure there. Like I said, I mean, there are three parts. There is the prognosis, the pathology and paroxysm. So before the diagnosis and treatment, and then sort of the fallout after you pass. But again, like I wanted something that was representative of the actual grieving experience, which is very much non-linear.
Exactly.
It does not happen from start to finish. It happens in fits and starts. It happened like, you could be years separated from the event and then, only begin to process this one instance, this one, fragment of it years later. And it's just like I said, like it's not going to happen in this beautifully structured way where you can compartmentalize it, put it on a shelf and be done with it. And so again, like that's part of the reason why I wanted to do it, in a hybrid form, because you may grieve for months and then you may have a period of time where you're like good, and then all of a sudden it may pick up again. Like it just doesn't happen in this neat little way.
Right, that's what it is about your book. It's like it mimics that experience very well because I'll be laughing out loud in one section and then crying at the next and back to laughing. And I think you mentioned that your aunt also, right after your father passed, your aunt and you mentioned how everyone deals with grief in their own way, and your dad's sister maybe was going through her own way of it. And I guess this leads into my next question. How do you feel now that this book is sort of making its way out into the world and certain people will be reading and reacting?
I mean,
it's like the hallmark of this is like, you have to ask every memoirist this question. It's like,
there's no small amount of terror that comes with it. But I think for me, I tried to attack this in two different ways. At the start of the book, there is a disclaimer that basically says, this is a work of nonfiction, but it is a work of nonfiction, and it, is an account of experiences as I experienced them. Everybody experiences something differently. If it doesn't line up with somebody's particular, read on a situation, that's just the nature of things. But I knew going into this that I could very easily paint myself into a corner when I revisited these particular, moments and situations. And I very much so at the outset made sure, like I promised myself that I was not going to make a villain out of anybody in this book. I could easily have done so.
you're a good one.
But but what I tried well, here's what I mean. My only solution to that situation was, we react to things in real time, in the moment, based on so many different, physical and emotional stimuli, and years later may have a different read on things. So in recounting the things as they happened, I knew that it would be somehow false if I didn't include my impression at the time. But every time I do that, especially, when I run the risk of being a little bit too judgmental, I also make an attempt each and every time to try to understand years later where that person might have been coming from. Like, if the whole book is me trying to say there's no one way to grieve, then my way isn't the right way just as much as anybody else's is. Like, I may have thought so in the moment, but now looking back, some people need to separate themselves from the situation just to save themselves. And, some people don't have that option. And, as judgmental as I was in the moment, and as, as much as I needed to acknowledge that those were the emotions I had, I do try every single time to offer that perspective and to try to play devil's advocate. I feel like that was the only way I could really, balance the scales, was by doing that.
Right. Are we doing good on time? Are we good?
Yeah.
Okay. What's our 5, 10?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then should we do like a little Q&A?
Sure.
Okay. I don't know, we're here. Okay, so this is one of my favorite questions to ask writers. What has writer's book taught you about yourself? Something new, if anything.
I'm an indignant little shit now.
The candle pie, I love it.
What has it taught me about me as a writer or just as myself? As a writer, I think for me, it just taught me, don't ignore the hard stuff. I mean, the hard stuff is really where the stories are. If anything, I think people have a tendency to convince themselves that if they have a passion, which is a word I hate, if they have a passion, that acting on it will be just euphoric. I mean, from start to finish, it's going to be wonderful. I love to write, I love to act, I love to sing. So that means that anytime I'm writing and acting or singing, it's going to be wonderful and I'm going to love it. No, parts of it suck. And like you need to like acknowledge the fact that parts of it suck and that parts of it are work, and that doesn't make you any less of a writer, actor, singer, because some parts of it are hard and you choose to acknowledge that some parts of it are hard, but like you reckon with it and you work your way through it. As a person, I think it has, I think I've certainly grown as a person. I think that I have definitely learned to be more patient, perhaps give people more slack when it comes to really all matters. And this is coming from a person who is an avowed king of impatience. But in certain, in certain situations and in certain places, like really, I think I've tried to come away more empathetic, and I've tried to, I've tried to encourage people who are, seeking similar perspective or seeking, their way through or out of something. Like I just try to offer support and to be just a more accessible person and a more, a better friend, a better family member, what have you.
Gold. Do we have time for Q&A? Should we do it now? What time is that? What day is it? Do we have time? We do?
Yeah.
Does anyone want to ask any questions? I have like 1,000 more to ask this person, so.
Yes, what was your favorite response you got to the book so far?
My favorite response that I got to the book so far.
Should we pull Goodreads? There's always some gold in there.
Oh God. Okay, well, since we're in this specific store, it's not really my favorite response, but it's one that I actually think is quite funny, because there was somebody on Goodreads, funnily enough, who wrote about the book, gave it 5 stars, and yet at the same time said that they questioned why it was labeled as like queer or LGBTQ plus literature, because there's only one essay in there that deals with the topic of sexuality acutely. However, like I feel like my innate queerness, whatever you want to call it, like permeates the book in various ways. Like the fact that there are attempts to deal with things through humor, is a reflex response that I think a lot of queer people learn very quickly. But I think that like assertion that person raised begs the question, like, what is queer literature? Is it literature that solely deals with queer topics, or is it purely just literature that comes from a queer author? I tend to think it's the latter, but that's just me.
To the question. Anyone else? I have I do want to ask you, this is also not just a memoir, but it's also a really beautiful and touching portrait of a really good guy, a really good man. And I can imagine that it was probably hard to sort of like parse through the memories, that what you want to include for the sake of the narrative structure versus what you have to sort of, use as an extraneous material that you either put in your dead darlings folder or what have you. Were there any things that didn't make the cut of the book that you wish like you hope to see in another iteration or another work of fiction, a poem, script?
Anything that didn't make the cut.
I'm sure there are. I'm sure there were. Like honestly, the whole the essays truly started as just like a collection of random words in my notes app on my iPhone. I mean, just like I would, things that at first I didn't know if it merited an entire piece. Like, there's a piece in the book called "The Bottle is Irrelevant," and that was literally just born out of the words perfume bottle in my notes app. And I'm like, is there something here? And you really only can find out by exploring it and writing. But I mean, there were certain pieces that I either cut entirely or reimagined. But as far as like as far as this chapter of my life is concerned, I feel like the essentials are in there. I really don't feel like I left anything out that I meant to deal with or that I still feel like needs to be processed. I mean, there's plenty in my life that still needs processing, but not necessarily dealing to this particular topic. But I feel like it's all in there. Even the stuff that, isn't exactly the most flattering. And I there's a piece in there that literally one of my friends was like, do you want to put that in there? Are you sure you want people to read that about you? Yeah, I'm like, yeah, because like, I mean, when you spend so much time, like however long it lasts for a particular person, my father's illness lasted about 15 months. When you spend that much time vesting so much of your faith in science, a higher power, or some combination of the both, and then both of them fail you, or at least you perceive that they fail you, everything that was grounding you is not there anymore. And so you go flying around like somebody who just let go of a balloon. You just go bouncing off the walls, and like you do irrational things. You go to some dangerous places because everything that was holding you to the earth has sort of like lost its grasp on you. And so, yeah, like I felt this is not even answering your question.
No.
But I truly felt like there were places that, and moments that people close to me who I, allowed to read early drafts would, question and say like, it's not that they're poorly written, it's just that these are some pretty, these are some pretty dark moments. Like, and once you put it out there, it's out there and you can't take it back. And honestly, I kind of feel like there's a freedom in that because, again, like if I intend to connect with anybody, with a reader, like I can't just put the stuff in there that like makes me look good. Like I have to put everything in there because somebody may be out there feeling incredibly bad about something, foolish that they did. And I just kind of just want to be like, well, we all do stupid, foolish things. That's kind of part of the process.
Very true. Everything you say is like a prophecy. Meanwhile, I have a very loose understanding of subject verb agreement over here. I completely forgot what I was going to ask you, so I'm still remember with your answer. So I guess what I want to know now is, do you feel like this book, having written it, do you feel like you are open to exploring, I don't know, because you have a background in fiction, like what's next for you?
Oh, there it is.
There, yeah. To do it.
I have an idea that I'm really just like sort of loosely outlining another collection about a very different type of grief or loss, whatever you want to call it. With respect to like exploring other genres, like I definitely don't rule it out, but man, fiction is intimidating. Fiction is like truly intimidating. And I used to think it was the absolute opposite. Before I came into, like before I did my MFA, I was just like, oh, fiction, like, just make up a story, use your imagination, like writing about yourself, like that sounds impossible. Like, how do I make that feel compelling? How do I write my own story in a way that somebody actually wants to read it? And going through this, I mean, nonfiction is not easy by any stretch of the imagination, but when I get lost in the work of like really good fiction writers, I sort of want to like just hide in the dark for a while, because I'm just like, I don't know if I'll be able to like write something that is, that rises to the level of, a Rebecca Mackay or whomever.
Are there any, I just call them fictionalists. The novelists. What should I just tell you? Anyway.
Go trademark that now. Put it on a t-shirt.
What, were there any fiction writers that you held near and dear to your heart while writing this? Or whom?
There were a lot. I mean, like, it's funny, like throughout the entire process, I mean, I go in phases, but I do tend to immerse myself in a lot of queer literature. The Great Believers, by Rebecca Mackay, Andrew Sean Greer's Less. I still have not read Less as Lost, but I plan to, because Less was amazing. There was even like classic works like Morris, E.M. Forster's Morris, I think is like a phenomenal book, which I only learned about having seen Matthew Lopez's The Inheritance, which was a fantastic play. Another sort of, you could call it a work of fiction because it is, even if it's an adaptation. I reread that play, and like there's a great many that, and I find fiction to actually be a very welcome escape, if you want to call it that, when you're writing nonfiction, because I think sometimes, whether or not this is true, if you're writing within a certain discipline, I have this like weird innate fear to not read too much of that genre while I'm writing it, because I'm afraid I'm gonna rip that person.
Yes, like the tone slips in. Like I can't read like, I don't know, like David Sedaris, because that sort of humor is gonna like subconsciously seep into the
Right,
words.
as if anything that I write could ever rise to the level of David Sedaris, but like, it is funny that you say that, because I think about that all the time. I'm like, I don't, like, I'm afraid to, if I see the word, whatever.
I know, it's like if Steve writes a joke about a cranberry bog, I'm like, do I?
I can't write about cranberries now. I swear to God, I have to go through that. I make sure there's no mention of cranberries.
Exactly. What is that? What is that? Yeah, I can't read, like if I'm working on memoir, I'm reading fiction. Like I can't.
I don't exclusively like ignore memoir, but I tend to read opposite the genre.
Right. Yeah.
For a time.
Thing. That is apparently a thing.
I don't know, but I ask this question all the time of like other writers, like how do you, especially really across discipline, but it's like, how do you confront the idea of the possibility of writing something that comes off as like derivative? Like, is that a fear you have? And I mean, everything we write is sort of derivative.
Right.
Something
Yeah. We are
just it's impossible to write something that doesn't remind you of something else.
The only thing that's unique about it is it's being filtered through your lens.
Exactly.
And only you have that ability to sort of filter it out. We are all just interpreting the human experience in our own way. And that's why I feel like there's no such thing as too many grief memoirs or too many comedic memoirs, because we're all not at all. Like the more the merrier. Like I wish
there's enough grief to go around.
We shouldn't be
trauma.
We shouldn't be stingy.
It's gratuitous with it.
Any other questions? Because as you can see, I can keep going. Anyone else? No? Anything else that we should address? Anything else that you want me to ask you about? No. Okay. We good? Yeah.
Awesome.
Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you, Joe. This is truly an outstanding work from an author who I'm sure we're going to hear about for years and years to come. And I don't say that lightly. I am very judgmental and
Wait till you find out that it's only because I'll be on America's Most Wanted at some point. That's why
I would love to see it.
Yeah.
I'd love to read it. Thank you so much, everyone. And everyone online.
Thank you guys. Yes, thanks everybody.
Go out and get this book. Seriously, get this book.
That's a threat.
It is a threat.
That's a threat.
And I make do in my
Don't
threats.
follow up on that.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. All right.